Hi, everybody. Let's shift to Ukraine, where the latest talk is that Washington is preparing in some form to recognize Russian control over certain territories. Donbass, various oblasts that have joined the Russian Federation. We hear of discussions in Geneva involving Marco Rubio, American officials, European representatives, and Ukrainian delegates. There is talk of further meetings between American envoys and Russian officials like Sergei Lavrov or Ushakov. Some analysts, like Mearsheimer, are essentially correct in their broad assessment. What is being discussed is the codification of a Russian victory that has already occurred on the battlefield and along the geopolitical margins. The West is trying to find a way to acknowledge that without admitting defeat. The Europeans, true to form, will try to spin and distort it, to dilute the reality, to make it seem less definitive, to hide the fact that their grand strategy has been shattered. But they cannot escape the basic truth. Their attempt to use Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia has failed catastrophically. From Russia's point of view, these talks will not go anywhere. Russia does not want them to go. Moscow holds the initiative. The West has lost badly. It has failed in its political objectives, its economic war, and its military proxy campaign. That is why Western leaders are so desperate not to admit the obvious, the precedent of Western deceit. To understand the current peace theater, you have to go back to the Battle of Debaltsevo in February 2015. At that time, Ukraine fielded a much smaller army, roughly 80,000 troops. Near Debaltsevo, a large force of Ukrainian soldiers was effectively encircled by militias from Donetsk and Lugansk, with support from Wagner fighters. The Ukrainians were on the verge of total collapse. It was their Custer's last stand. Angela Merkel, then Chancellor of Germany, jumped on a plane to Moscow. She begged Putin to agree to a ceasefire. François Hollande of France joined in. Barack Obama and Joe Biden signaled their support from Washington. Alexander Lukashenko hosted the talks in Belarus. The result was Minsk II. At the time, many people in good faith believed Minsk II was a genuine effort at peace. Putin himself believed the West. But 7 years later, Merkel and Hollande openly admitted that Minsk II was a ploy, a ruse. It was never intended to end the conflict. Its purpose was to buy time for Ukraine to rearm, retrain, refit, and prepare for a larger war against Russia. That admission is crucial. It means that when Western politicians and diplomats talk about ceasefires and peace plans, they are not asking for peace. They are asking Russia to stop winning long enough for them to rearm their proxy. What we are seeing now, the Trump plan, Rubio's travels, informal channels, is Minsk III in spirit. The West is in yet another moment of desperation. Its Ukrainian project is failing again. It wants to freeze the front, regroup, and try once more under a different excuse. The absurd fantasy of an 800,000-man Ukrainian army. One of the more grotesque elements in this new plan involves the proposed size of the Ukrainian army. Trump's camp floated the idea of a 600,000-strong Ukrainian force. The Europeans, never content with merely being unrealistic, pushed that to 800,000. Think about that. The combined armies of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany total around 500,000 troops, slightly less, and the Europeans are now fantasizing about a Ukraine that, on paper, would field an army larger than those three powers combined. All this while promising, of course, that Ukraine will never join NATO. They want a country that is, in practice, a giant NATO military camp on Russia's border, but without the formal designation, so they can claim they have respected earlier promises. If Ukraine ever truly fielded an 800,000-man army as a de facto NATO member, it would be the second largest army in the alliance, behind only the United States. It would surpass Turkey, whose armed forces number roughly 320,000. It would dwarf every European military force. And they expect Russia to accept this? Look back to March 2022, when Russia and Ukraine actually negotiated seriously and reached a tentative agreement. Russia then accepted that Ukraine could have a standing army of 85,000. Ukraine agreed. That number made sense for a neutral state. But the West intervened. Boris Johnson famously flew in to torpedo the talks, and the war continued. Now we have Trump's camp pushing 600,000 and the Europeans demanding 800,000. All of this aimed at a country whose real population is now probably around 19, 20 million after massive emigration and war losses. It is mathematically and demographically absurd. This is not serious security planning. It is political theater designed to preserve the illusion that Ukraine can still be built up as a massive anti-Russian bulwark. It confirms what should be obvious by now. The West is not interested in a neutral Ukraine. It wants a militarized Ukraine pointed at Russia. The reality of Ukrainian losses. The actual state of the Ukrainian armed forces is the exact opposite of these fantasies. So far this year, the Russian Ministry of Defense has reported that Ukraine is losing roughly 40,000 killed and wounded every month. Western sources that are strongly pro-NATO actually corroborate the basic picture of unsustainable losses, not in their overall narrative, but in the numbers they let slip. The Atlantic Council, a vehemently pro-Ukraine organization, admits that Ukraine loses about 20,000 soldiers per month through desertion alone. The Institute for the Study of War, run by the Kagan Network, closely linked to people like Victoria Nuland and backed by figures like Jack Keane, puts some monthly casualty figures as high as 40,000. On the replenishment side, Ukraine reportedly manages to recruit only about 17,000 men per month. If you add perhaps 13,000 wounded who are patched up and sent back to the front, you might get 30,000 bodies flowing into the system monthly. Against that, you have 60,000 to 80,000 flowing out, killed, maimed, or gone AWOL. Net monthly loss, at least 30,000 soldiers. No army on earth can sustain that. Consider the analogy with personal finances. If you earn $30,000 a month, but your regular expenses are $60,000, bankruptcy is inevitable. It's only a question of time. Ukraine is bankrupt in military terms. The only question is how the collapse is managed or not. This is the real reason Washington suddenly discovered its inner pacifist and started talking about giving peace a chance. Not because of any moral awakening, but because the Ukrainian army is being ground down faster than it can be replenished. The empire sees the writing on the wall, right at the top in Kiev. The military disaster is mirrored by political decay at the top. The West's favorite hero in Kiev, Zelensky, is surrounded by oligarchs, fixers, and operatives who have treated this war as a business opportunity. Look at the case of Andriy Yermak, the so-called Rasputin behind Zelensky, formerly his business manager and producer, now his chief of staff and top security fixer. Yermak is out. The fact that he left upright and breathing is itself revealing. Men in his position almost always have documentation, receipts, as we say about who got paid off, which Western leaders took money, which companies skimmed off so-called aid packages. Do you really think no Western politicians have personally enriched themselves via this war? Think of names like Boris Johnson, Kaja Kallas, Mark Rutte, and others. If Yermak starts talking, if he cooperates with one side or another, a lot of respected Western statesmen could be exposed as war profiteers. He will not willingly be the sole fall guy. That means either he dies mysteriously, suicide, accident, sudden heart problem, or Zelensky's own political days are numbered. If Yermak survives for long, you can be sure he has levers to pull. In that case, it's Zelensky who will be eased out, one way or another. This is how defeated regimes unravel, not with heroic last stands, but with backstabbing, leaks, and frantic attempts to offload blame. A country past the point of no return. If you look at standard U.S. military doctrine, a unit that has suffered 10% casualties is considered combat ineffective. It needs to be withdrawn, refitted, reconstituted. Ukraine is far past that threshold in multiple formations. Its population has been bled out, its young men scattered to Europe or buried in the steppe. Even if Russia stopped its advance today and simply maintained the current lines, Ukraine would still be disintegrating economically, demographically, and socially. The economy is wrecked. The infrastructure is shredded. Millions have left and will not return. This is not a country on the verge of some heroic comeback. It is a failing state being kept breathing by Western cash injections and propaganda. Meanwhile, many of the Western experts boosting the war, retired generals, think tank fellows, media pundits, are financially incentivized to keep lying. They make money off the conflict. Board seats, consulting contracts, book deals, speaking fees. They are paid to maintain illusions long after reality has buried them. Russian economic and strategic leverage. Russia's advantage is not only on the battlefield, it is increasingly economic and geographic. Consider the southern reaches of the Dnieper River around Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Russian advances there mean Moscow has, or soon will have, effective control over major river traffic. That matters because roughly 60% of Ukraine's GDP is tied to goods moving along that waterway. Grain, raw materials, manufactured products. Russia does not need to bomb every city or slaughter civilians to cripple Ukraine's economy. It can simply control the river, inspect or block shipments, and choke off exports passing through Black Sea ports like Odessa. The economic strangulation is already underway. If it hasn't completely dried up yet, it will. This is the other face of Russian strategy. Using positional advantage and economic choke points rather than mindless destruction. It is the opposite of the Western caricature of Russia as some blind, brutal force. In reality, Russia is acting with a cold, methodical rationality. The end state, a neutral Ukraine. If the West allows it, what does Russia actually want in the long term regarding Ukraine? The answer has been consistent. A neutral state, something like Austria during the Cold War, or Sweden and Finland before they joined NATO. A country with a modest army sized to its own security, not a forward operating base for an aggressive alliance. Russia does not want to fight NATO forever on its border. It wants a buffer that is stable and not hostile. A Ukraine that is demilitarized enough not to pose a threat, but strong enough to police itself. The problem is not Russia's willingness to accept that. The problem lies in the psychosis of Western elites. Macron, Starmer, Rutte, Scholz, von der Leyen, and the rest of that tribe. By every rational measure, they have led their countries into a strategic disaster. Yet, like so many failed commanders throughout history, they double down rather than retreat. There is a long tradition of this kind of self-destructive behavior. Look at Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia. He built a massive force of roughly 650,000 men and stocked up supplies in advance. As soon as he crossed into what is now Belarus and parts of Ukraine, his army started bleeding out. Disease, hunger, supply breakdowns, desertions. Within a few weeks, he had lost around 150,000 men. Some generals warned him to reconsider. Instead of adjusting, he plowed ahead. He reached Moscow, which the Russians then burned. When he finally realized the scale of his mistake and began retreating in October, thousands of kilometers separated him from safety. In the end, only about 40,000 of the original 650,000 straggled back to Europe. The disaster was visible in advance, and Napoleon was warned. He refused to listen. Today, NATO is repeating the same pattern, this time against a far more resilient Russia with far more limited tools and far weaker political cohesion. It is reinforcing strategic failure instead of cutting its losses. Russia is the one repeating history, but in the role of the patient defender, not the reckless invader. Hatred, insurgency, and Russia's unique experience. When this war ends, and it will end on Russia's terms, the hardest problem will not be redrawing boundaries. It will be dealing with the hatreds and traumas that war inevitably creates, especially among the defeated on the Ukrainian side, especially among those steeped in Nazi ideology. The bitterness will be intense. On the Russian side, too, there will be anger at the atrocities committed by Ukrainian units and foreign mercenaries. That emotional landscape does not suddenly dissolve the day a formal peace is signed. The best outcome is not some naive kumbaya scenario. There is no such thing. The best outcome is a settlement that does not inflame tensions further, that creates a security architecture limiting the ability of extremists to restart the war, and that gradually builds new loyalties and identities over time. Will Europe help? Almost certainly not. The Europeans will keep money and weapons flowing into whatever remains of Ukraine, openly if they can, covertly if they must. They will treat Ukrainian territory as a perpetual nuisance on Russia's border. They will encourage subversion and terrorism while pretending to support freedom fighters. So what should Russia do? If I were advising the Russian high command, I would say this: finish it. Don't leave an armed, Nazi-infested, Western-funded proto-state festering on your border. End its military capacity decisively. Force the enemy to a position where it cannot realistically contest the settlement. History shows that durable peace often comes not from compromise with an intact enemy, but from a thorough defeat. Think of how World War II ended in Europe and Asia. The Axis powers were crushed so completely that they could not meaningfully resist the post-war order. That is why reconstruction was possible. With Ukraine, if the West is allowed to maintain a large, armed, ideologically radicalized remnant, then every future peace will be fragile. The extremists will keep fighting in their own way for years. Yet, there is one country that has shown it knows how to deal with this kind of problem, both militarily and politically: Russia. Russia fought a brutal, decade-long conflict in Chechnya, a foreign-backed insurgency funded and supported by the CIA and MI6. It was savage. Thousands died on both sides. Yet today, Chechen units are among Russia's most loyal and effective troops, fighting enthusiastically against Ukraine's Nazi battalions. I have spoken to people like General Aptia Laudinov, a Chechen commander who lost family members in that war. He leads the Akhmat units, largely Muslim, and speaks of Putin with genuine respect and even affection. That is not propaganda. It's the perspective of someone who saw his homeland destroyed and then rebuilt. How did Russia achieve this? First, by winning the war. Second, by investing heavily in reconstruction, diverting resources from other regions to rebuild Chechnya. Third, by integrating local leaders with real authority and legitimacy into the Russian state. Today, Grozny is rebuilt. Chechnya hosts one of the largest mosques in the world. Moscow put its money and political capital into turning a former battlefield into a loyal part of the Federation. So when people ask whether Russia can pacify Ukraine after victory, my answer is, it has already proven in Chechnya that it knows how to extinguish an insurgency and then construct a durable peace based on respect, resources, and inclusion. Ukraine will be a bigger, more complicated version of that challenge. It has NATO countries around it that will try to keep the fire burning. But Russia has the experience, the endurance, and the strategic culture to handle it. Europe's self-inflicted collapse and Russia's refusal to board a dying plane. While all this plays out, Europe has set its own house on fire. Its economies are weakening. Its energy prices are distorted. Its industries are hollowing out, all in the name of a policy that has failed to break Russia. You see the desperation in the ridiculous gestures, like the half-serious talk of inviting Russia back into a G8. When Putin was asked about this, he laughed. Why, he asked, would Russia want to join a plane that is about to crash? That is what the G7 economies look like from Moscow's point of view. Debt-addicted, deindustrializing, politically chaotic, incapable of protecting their own interests. Russia is integrating with Eurasia, BRICS, and the Global South. It has no desire to re-enter a Western club that offers nothing but lectures and economic decline. The old imperial center is collapsing inward. Russia is moving outward, building something new. Zaporizhzhia, nuclear power, and the climate crisis. One of the key questions in any settlement will be the future of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. From Russia's vantage point, it is now on Russian territory. It is a critical energy asset that can power large swaths of industrial activity. In a rational world, once hostilities end and responsibilities are clearly defined, Zaporizhzhia's output would be shared in a way that benefits both Russia and whatever remains of Ukraine. That would require recognizing two things. First, that Russia has sovereign control over it. Second, that humanity as a whole faces a far greater threat than any one regional conflict, the climate crisis. We are already beyond certain temperature thresholds from which there is no easy return. The world is heading towards serious climate disruption. Against that backdrop, fighting endless proxy wars while ignoring decarbonization and energy transitions is suicidal. For a long time, many scientists argued nuclear power was too expensive. But advances in technology and changing cost structures are making nuclear more feasible, roughly half the historic cost in some projections. Zaporizhzhia is an older complex, but nuclear energy, whether fission, future fusion, or hybrids, has to be part of a serious global strategy alongside wind, solar, and other innovations. Yet, instead of focusing on that, Western elites are consumed by geopolitical games in Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon. They are fighting over a burning ship while ignoring the fire. Israel, Lebanon, and the road to catastrophe with Iran. Let me turn to Israel and its behavior toward Lebanon and Iran, because it is another theater where the empire is courting disaster. Washington has given Israel a green light again and again to bomb Lebanon, to escalate against Hezbollah, and to treat Lebanese sovereignty as a nuisance. But bombing alone never wins wars. The historical record is clear. Apart from the use of atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no strategic bombing campaign has decisively determined the outcome of a major conflict. Look at Iraq. The shock and awe bombing campaign didn't bring real victory. Massive air power didn't deliver strategic success. Years of bombing didn't topple the government. Ultimately, if you want to control territory, you need ground forces and you need a political plan. Israel does not have that. The Israeli army is, in my view, an undisciplined force prone to collective punishment and indiscriminate violence. It has just spent years battering Gaza, a narrow strip of land roughly 5 by 25 miles, without being able to pacify it. It turned entire neighborhoods into rubble, created hundreds of thousands of homeless Palestinians, and killed countless civilians. But it did not achieve a sustainable military or political outcome. A serious post-war strategy would require picking up trash, restoring water and sewage, turning the lights on, rebuilding institutions, and offering some kind of civil order. Israel has shown no interest or ability in doing that. Its specialty is prolonged suffering, not solution. Now, extend this logic to Lebanon. Israel has bombed Lebanon repeatedly, targeting not just Hezbollah or alleged terrorist camps, but economic infrastructure, ports, roads, power facilities. The goal is transparent: prevent Lebanon from becoming, again, what it once was, the economic and cultural hub of the Eastern Mediterranean. A prosperous, independent Lebanon with control over its offshore gas fields is unacceptable to Israeli planners who want dominance over regional energy flows. Meanwhile, the United States has built the most expensive embassy in the world in Lebanon, effectively a command center for the CIA, MI6, and Mossad. This is not an embassy in any traditional sense. It is a forward operating base. Israel would love to raise its flag over Beirut's government buildings one day, directly or indirectly. Overlay all of that with Israel's obsession with Iran. A war with Iran, in Israeli strategic thinking, includes attempts to neutralize Hezbollah. We see Israeli jets probing Iraqi airspace, approaching Iranian borders, refueled by American planes. Contracts are being signed with Boeing for more tanker aircraft. Israeli personnel are being killed in Syria. The pieces for escalation are being moved into place. The greatest danger is that Israel might decide to try to use nuclear weapons against Iran, thinking it can decapitate Iran's nuclear program or leadership in one blow. That would be suicidal. Israel does not have enough nuclear warheads to destroy Iran as a functioning country. It could massacre people and take out some sites, but Iran would remain capable of devastating retaliation, and retaliation would not be limited to Iran alone. Pakistan, a nuclear power, is increasingly aligning itself with Iran. An Israeli nuclear strike could, for the first time, create a scenario in which Pakistan feels compelled to use its arsenal in defense of a fellow Muslim nation. Israel would be signing its own national death warrant